Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're going to go through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we've just finished looking at the games of Bogulubov. That was game number 55 in the book. And after this, Reti talks about his own system of opening, which is coined to the Reti opening. Now, he offers quite an in-depth analysis of the opening, and then he offers a full game where he plays Rubinstein, and then the latter half of a game where he plays Romanowski. So because this is quite a big chapter, and it's too big to do in one video, I think, I'm going to split it into 3 videos for each of the 3 sections. So this first video is going to look at his initial analysis of his opening. So for starters, he talks about e4 and e5, or d4, d5, talking about why he dismisses them. So he says that if white plays with a centre pawn, such as e4 or d4, and black responds symmetrically with e5 or d4, d5, then what normally happens is, let's focus on e4, e5 for now. What normally happens is white will try and make this pawn the center of attack. However, likewise, so white will normally try and make this pawn center of attack by playing moves like knight f3. After defending, they can try and play bishop to b5 to add more pressure to this pawn. They might try and push f4 or d4 later on to try and trade black center pawn off, leaving white with a central advantage. However, he also states that black will also try and make this pawn, white's pawn, a center of attack. Often, black will often try and push d5 to try and trade off white's center pawn. And likewise in d4, d5 openings, black here will often try and push c5 to try and trade off white's center pawn. And so in these positions, the center pawns are often the target of attack for both players. And he says because of this, as soon as white plays d4 and black responds with d5 or e4, e5, black has a very clear direction of attack. Black's plans are quite clear, black's plans are quite straightforward. And so he doubts that, he's sort of saying that he doesn't believe e4 or d4 are the best first moves, because they become the focal points of black's attack. Now he says that, granted, moves like, say, e4 do offer open lines for the pieces. They do immediately control the center. However, because they are points of attack, that's their main weakness. They are going to become a very easy focal point of attack for black, and therefore should be avoided. He does say that an opening is a fight for the center, and therefore any opening system must apply pressure to the center. And therefore he argues that white should avoid fixing the pawns in the center with e4 or d4, because if they have these moves in reserve, then white can apply pressure to the center a lot easier. Therefore, he argues that knight f3 is actually the best move to apply pressure in the center. So it prevents black from playing e5, and white still has the option of pushing something like e4 or d4. Now he says the downside of this move is that it blocks the f-pawn. However, because the f-pawn weakens the king, he argues it should rarely be played early on. Now he comments that if black were to respond aligned with the most classical principles and immediately try and grab space in the center with his pawn, playing d5, it's the most logical move, it's the most principled move. Now here, Retí comments that white has a few options. So he says that white can respond with with opening system that resembles the King's Indian defense, with something like perhaps d6, g3, perhaps even e4, and or in this instance, white's going to push g3 and c4, which is also quite King's Indian defense style. However, Retí comments that this opening has sort of been coined to the King's Indian attack for that reason, due to the similarities. However, he is very much against it being coined the King's Indian attack, because he says that visually there may be similarities between the King's Indian defense and the King's Indian attack, but in reality, in the King's Indian defense, where black will often meet d4 with knight f6, d6, g6, e5, bishop to g7. He says that this is a defense by black. So this is a defense by black, where black is going to try and defend white's attack. So he's arguing that here this shouldn't be called the King's Indian attack, because it's not. Although it may appear visually similar to black's King's Indian defense, it's got the main difference in that white isn't striving for equality. White is striving for an opening advantage. White is hoping to bring their first move advantage and convert it. And therefore, he also talks about the different. He says there's a couple of systems now. One of the systems was developed by Nimzowitsch, which is b3 here. And Retí comments that Nimzowitsch, he played a lot of Indian systems where he aims. So Nimzowitsch played a lot of the King's Indian defences. He was very much a pioneer for it. And here, Nimzowitsch aims to play bishop to b2 and apply a lot of pressure to this e5 pawn. However, Retí comments that he doesn't believe this is as good for white, because white's not trying to open up the position to their advantage. White's essentially playing very similar to how you would in a King's Indian defense, which he dislikes, because white should be trying to gain an advantage rather than trying to defend. So the idea of this system is, after bishop b2, white will try and create a strong point on this e5. So this is black's weak square, and white is going to try and use it to their advantage. White's going to try and make this their weak square, and hopefully white's going to try and make this weak square by black into their own strong square, and hopefully put a piece there, I guess ideally a knight. And conversely, this d5 pawn is one of black's strong points. But white is going to essentially leave the strong point alone. White's going to give black their strong points if they wish, but focus on their weak points. However, Retí argues that in this position, black is able to get a relatively closed position, where often the centre pawns might still be pushed and the centre will be quite closed, and therefore white's first move advantage will be a bit less relevant, because in closed centres you have far more time to manoeuvre around. So because of that, Retí says that he believes the move c4 is better. It doesn't attack black's weak e5 square, but instead threatens to immediately strike at black's strongest point, d5. So he's intending to try and continue with bishop g3 and bishop g2, just applying a huge amount of pressure to this strong point, and maybe even e4 later on. And he comments that at the time of writing his book, the best method of defense isn't found. And of course, opening up the position is always going to be a bit more beneficial to black, because it's always going to be a bit more beneficial to white, because white has the first move, so they're always going to have that initial lead in development. Now here there's a few different moves. The most obvious, well, the first one is e6. Retí doesn't really cover this, for the simple fact that he comments that this is a possible move, but it blocks in this light square bishop and there's no real need to block it in. The other move is d4, which we will see in the game versus Rubinstein. And the last move which we look at in this video is c6. Now, the benefit of this move is that black can develop the bishop. Oh, sorry, also black can potentially take, but white could just win the pawn back with something like knight a3 or e3 to take it here. And black can't defend the pawn because they go to here. And obviously a6 you take here, they can't take back because I'll lose the rook. And even then, if it's c6, they can go to here, take. And our knight to b5 will potentially win this pawn here. And again, they can't defend because they would be down the exchange. But d takes c4 is still a potential option. But c6 is what we look at in this video. So here, especially with c6, with e6, black is still not really threatening to win this pawn, because worst case scenario, white can win it back with queen a4 check. But with c6, black can potentially win this pawn now, because now the move b5 is immediately defended by the c6 pawn, and there is no queen check. Black's almost a move ahead in the variations we looked at. When black takes here and we play this, where white is immediately attacking. But if black takes here and we play this, black's immediately got this quite strong defense, and it's going to be white's not going to be in time to break it down. So he comments that b3 is best to defend the c4 pawn. And now there's two moves. He comments that bishop f5 is perhaps the most challenging, but bishop to g5 has been played by both Bogolubov and Capablanca against Reti. But bishop f5 is what he covers in this video. And the idea is to just get the bishop outside of the pawn chain before we play e6. And later on we might consider playing something like h6 to give the bishop a retreat square. Now Reti continues with the standard plan, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, again starting to apply pressure to this pawn. e6, bishop to b2, just getting the pieces out. Knight b to d7, castles, and bishop d6. So Reti comments that this is quite a common place for the bishop, and it looks very active. However, it has a downside in that it is potentially exposed here after the d-file opens up, and also if the d-file does open up, it will be blocking this queen. So he thinks the more passive bishop e7 may be a bit better. So here he recommends d3. Now he comments that if this bishop had been out still inside the pawn chain, so if black had played e6 straight away, then d4 may even be an option. But d3 is played. And now after castles, now here he recommends knight to c3. And the reason is knight to d2 may seem a bit more natural because you're not blocking in your own bishop. This is a very strong bishop. But the idea of this opening is to apply a huge amount of pressure to black's strongest point, the pawn on d5. And knight c3 helps do that. Now h6 is often played to try and give the bishop a retreat square. And now Reti likes to move h3 because it prevents bishop g4. So white wants to try and push e4. However, e4 may be met by bishop g4. But now e4, there is no bishop g4, so the bishop has to go to g6 or to h7. After queen e7 and queen c2, Reti now comments that white should now have more control over the center and is now almost ready to push e4. I mean, even this h3 move isn't strictly necessary. The computer actually gives e4 as a potential move right now. And the idea is to just really attack this d5 pawn. But this is as far as Retí goes in this variation of the opening. And it's almost like an English in some ways, starting with move c5 and fianchetting the bishop. But the idea is quite clear that White is going to try and develop all of their pieces to attack Black's strongest point, d5, to really open up the center and remove Black's pawn in the center, and to try and gain your own central advantage. Now, as I said before, in the next video, we're going to be looking at a game where Retí plays this opening against Rubinstein. Except in that game, Rubinstein plays d4 a bit earlier on. Slightly different move order, but hopefully it will give us a good idea as to his plans in those instances. So if you'd like this video, please like, comment and subscribe, and I will hopefully see you in the next video where we will continue to look at this opening. Thank you for watching.